The age of the one of a kind. Imagine it is 1790. You are a soldier in the newly formed United States Army. Your musket, your primary tool of survival, breaks a small spring or a trigger pin. In 1790, you couldn't just order a spare part. You couldn't go to a bin and pick up a replacement. Why? Because every single musket in the world was a unique piece of art. Back then, master gunsmiths filed, hammered, and polished every screw and barrel by hand. If a screw was a fraction of a millimeter too wide, it didn't matter, because they would just hand drill a hole to match that specific screw. This was the craft system. It produced beautiful machines, but it was a logistical nightmare. If 100 guns broke on a battlefield, you had 100 different problems that required a master blacksmith to fix. The young United States, still reeling from the Revolution and fearing a new war with France, realized they had a massive problem. They couldn't arm a nation if every gun took a month to build. Eli Whitney and the Grand Illusion. Enter Eli Whitney. Most Americans know him for the cotton gin, but his true legacy, and perhaps his greatest hustle, was the musket. In 1798, with war clouds gathering, the U.S. government issued a massive contract for 10,000 muskets. Whitney, a man with a brilliant mind and a mountain of debt, promised to deliver them in just 2 years. His pitch was revolutionary. He wouldn't use craftsmen, he would use machines. He promised that every part of every gun would be exactly the same, interchangeable. In 1801, Whitney walked into a room filled with government officials, including President-elect Thomas Jefferson. He laid out piles of musket parts, triggers, hammers, barrels, and stocks. He invited the officials to pick one part from each pile and assemble a working gun. It worked perfectly. The officials were stunned. The twist? Here is a fact for your audience. Whitney actually cheated. He had secretly marked the parts to ensure they fit together, and his machines weren't actually ready yet. It took him 8 years, not 2, to deliver the guns. But while Whitney was the marketing man for the idea, the seed had been planted. The U.S. government realized if they could master this interchangeability, they could dominate the world. The real heroes, the armorers. While Whitney was busy being the face of the movement, the real hard work was happening at the Springfield and Harper's Ferry armories. This is where the American system of manufacturing was actually born. Men like John Hall and Simeon North spent decades perfecting the precision required. They realized that to make parts interchangeable, you couldn't rely on a human eye. You needed gauges, metal templates that a part had to fit through perfectly. If the part didn't fit the gauge, it was melted down. By the 1840s, John Hall's rifle works were achieving the impossible. A soldier could drop his rifle in the mud in Virginia, pick up a trigger from a broken rifle from Maine, and it would snap into place with a satisfying click. America had achieved what the French and British had failed to do. They had digitized physical objects before computers even existed. The Clockwork Revolution. Once the armory practice was perfected, it leaked out into the civilian world. This is where the story gets exciting for your viewers. The first industry to steal this idea wasn't cars, it was clocks. Before interchangeable parts, a clock was a luxury for the rich. But Connecticut clockmakers like Chauncey Jerome and Seth Thomas adopted the armory system. They used machines to stamp out identical brass gears. Suddenly, a clock that used to cost $50, months of wages, cost $2. America became the timekeeper of the world. Then came the sewing machines. Isaac Singer used interchangeable parts to put a machine in every home. Then came the bicycles. By the late 1800s, America was a nation of precision. We weren't just making things, we were making the machines that make things. The motor car, the ultimate evolution. Everything changed in 1908. A man named Henry Ford took the interchangeable dream to its logical, extreme conclusion. Before the Model T, cars were toys for the wealthy. They were hand-built by motor mechanics who spent weeks fitting a single engine together. Ford realized that if he used the Springfield Armory's precision and added a moving assembly line, he could change the world.
Because every part was identical, a worker didn't have to be a master mechanic. They just had to do one job: tighten bolt 42. Bolt 42 was exactly the same every time. This allowed Ford to churn out a car every 90 minutes. But here is the true fact that really connects the dots. Many of the engineers who helped Ford build the assembly line actually came from the bicycle and gun industries. The technology used to make a Civil War musket was the direct ancestor to the engine in the Model T. The success, the middle class, is born. This invention didn't just build cars, it built the American middle class. Because the parts were interchangeable, the cars were cheap. Because the cars were cheap, everyone bought one. Because everyone bought one, Ford could pay his workers $5 a day, double the national average at the time. Interchangeable parts turned the art of making things into the science of manufacturing. It moved the power from the hands of the elite craftsman into the hands of the factory worker and the consumer. The legacy, from muskets to microchips. Today, we take this for granted. When you buy a replacement charger for your phone, you don't worry if it will fit the port. When a mechanic replaces a spark plug in your SUV, they don't have to hand file it to fit your engine. But this wasn't an accident of history. It was a 100-year-old mission that started with a struggling inventor named Eli Whitney and a government that was tired of broken guns. It's the reason America became the arsenal of democracy in World War II, because we could build tanks, planes, and ships faster than the enemy because our parts were standardized while theirs were still being hand-fitted. Conclusion: the invisible miracle. The next time your audience looks at a simple screw or a Lego brick, remember this: they are looking at the greatest achievement in American history. It's not a monument or a statue. It's the fact that things fit. The American system took the uniqueness out of the object and put the power into the system. From the muskets of the 1700s to the SpaceX rockets of today, the secret to our success has always been the same. The perfection of the part is the strength of the whole.
The tyranny of distance. In the early 1800s, the United States was a massive, silent wilderness. Information traveled only as fast as a horse could gallop. If a president was elected in Washington, D.C., it could take weeks for a farmer in Ohio to hear the news. The world was disconnected, and distance was a physical wall that kept humanity apart. Then came the spark. In the 1830s and 40s, an American painter turned inventor named Samuel Morse didn't just want to send mail, he wanted to send lightning. Morse, alongside brilliant minds like Alfred Vail, developed the telegraph. It was a simple system: a battery, a switch, and a wire. By topping the switch, you completed a circuit, sending a pulse of electricity to a receiver miles away. The language of the pulse. But electricity doesn't speak English. To make the telegraph work, Morse had to invent a new language: Morse code. A short tap was a dot, a long hold was a dash. For the first time in human history, information was decoupled from physical travel. By the 1860s, the telegraph wires were the nervous system of America. They followed the railroads stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln sat in the telegraph office of the War Department, receiving real-time updates from the front lines. The telegraph had shrunk the continent, but it had a glaring limitation. It was cold. It was mechanical. You could send a message of love or a declaration of war, but it always sounded the same: click-clack, click-clack. The quest for the harmonic telegraph. By the 1870s, the telegraph lines were clogged. They could only send one message at a time, and the Western Union Company was desperate for a way to send multiple messages over a single wire. They called this the harmonic telegraph. This is where our two protagonists enter the stage. Alexander Graham Bell, a teacher of the deaf with a deep obsession with the physics of sound, and Elisha Gray, an experienced electrical inventor.
Both men were racing to solve the same problem, but Bell had a secret weapon. He wasn't thinking like an electrician. He was thinking like a musician. Bell realized that if different telegraph reeds vibrated at different pitches, they could carry different messages. But then a radical thought struck him. If electricity could carry a pitch, why couldn't it carry the complex vibrations of the human voice? The liquid breakthrough. The race for the telephone is one of the most controversial moments in American history. On February 14, 1876, Alexander Graham Bell's lawyer filed a patent for the telephone. Just 2 hours later, some say even less, Elisha Gray's lawyer arrived at the same office to file a caveat, or an intent to patent, for a similar device. The coincidence was so tight that it sparked a legal battle that would last decades. But the eureka moment didn't happen in a patent office. It happened in a cramped, sweaty laboratory in Boston. Bell and his assistant, Thomas Watson, were experimenting with a liquid transmitter. Bell had realized that for electricity to mimic sound, it couldn't just be an on-off pulse like Morse code. It had to be a continuous, undulating current. It had to flow like a wave. On March 10, 1876, Bell knocked over a container of acid used in the transmitter and shouted the famous words, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you." Watson, standing at the receiver in another room, heard the voice clearly through the wire. The dots and dashes were dead. The voice was born. The invention of the hello. The early telephone was a hard sell. People thought it was a toy. Western Union, the giant of the telegraph world, famously turned down the chance to buy Bell's patent for $100,000, calling the telephone an electronic toy with no commercial value. It would go down as one of the biggest business blunders in history. As the Bell Telephone Company grew, they faced a strange problem. How do you start a conversation? Alexander Graham Bell suggested people should answer the phone by saying "ahoy" like a sailor. It was actually Thomas Edison who suggested hello, a word that was rarely used as a greeting before the telephone. The phone didn't just change our technology, it changed our vocabulary. The switchboard revolution. The telephone was an American success story not just because of the invention, but because of the infrastructure. To connect a city, you needed a central office. This birthed a new American icon, the telephone operator. Initially, the operators were teenage boys, but they were often too rude and distracted. The industry pivoted to hiring women, led by Emma Nutt, the world's first female operator. This created thousands of jobs and became a major stepping stone for women entering the American workforce. The chain reaction. From wires to wireless. The telephone didn't just replace the telegraph, it laid the groundwork for everything that followed. The vacuum tube. Invented to amplify telephone signals over long distances, it eventually became the brain of early computers. The transistor. Invented at Bell Labs in 1947 to replace mechanical telephone switches, it is now the building block of every microchip on Earth. The fiber optic cable. Developed to carry more telephone calls, it now carries the entire world's internet traffic. Conclusion. The human connection. The transition from the telegraph to the telephone was the moment America moved from transmitting data to connecting people. The telegraph was about the head, the facts, the news, the stock prices, but the telephone was about the heart. The sound of a mother's voice, the laughter of a friend, the immediate intimacy of a hello. Today, we carry descendants of Bell's liquid transmitter in our pockets. We no longer marvel at the miracle of a voice crossing an ocean in a millisecond. But beneath every smartphone, every video call, and every text message lies the ghost of those first dots and dashes, the electrical spark that proved that no matter how far apart we are always just one wire away from each other.
The sixth-story ceiling. If you walked through New York City in 1850, The skyline looked nothing like it does today. The tallest structures were church spires. Most buildings were capped at 5 or 6 stories. This wasn't because architects lacked imagination. It was because of two brutal physical realities: the human leg and the weight of the brick. First, nobody wanted to climb 10 flights of stairs to get to an office. The higher the floor, the lower the rent. The penthouse was a place for servants and storage, not the elite. Second, buildings were load-bearing. To support the weight of a stone building, the walls at the bottom had to be incredibly thick. If you wanted to build a 15-story building out of masonry, the ground floor walls would have to be so thick there would be no room for windows or doors. America was stuck in a low-rise trap, and as land prices in Manhattan and Chicago skyrocketed, the only way to survive was to go up. But to do that, humanity needed a miracle in 2 parts: a way to get people up and a way to hold the building together. The man who risked his life, Elisha Otis. The first piece of the puzzle fell into place in 1853 at the World's Fair in New York City. A failing mechanic named Elisha Otis stood on a platform high above a gasping crowd. He ordered his assistant to cut the only rope holding him up. In that era, elevators were death traps. If the rope snapped, you plummeted. But when the rope cut, the platform didn't fall. A jagged spring mechanism, the safety brake, snapped into the guide rails, locking Otis in place. He tipped his hat to the stunned crowd and famously said, "All safe, gentlemen, all safe." This was the spark. Before Otis, the elevator was a freight tool. After Otis, it was a vehicle for humans. But even with a safe ride, the buildings were still too heavy. The steam engine was already powering the factories and the railroads, but now it was about to be used to build the skeleton of the modern world. The Chicago Fire and the Skeleton of Steel. In 1871, the Great Chicago Fire leveled the city. It was a tragedy, but for architects, it was a blank canvas. A group of visionaries known as the Chicago School realized that if they kept building with stone and wood, the city would always be limited. An architect named William LeBaron Jenney had a eureka moment involving a simple bird cage. He realized that if you built a frame out of iron or steel, a skeleton, the walls didn't have to hold up the building anymore. The steel frame would do all the work. The walls could just be curtains of glass and thin masonry to keep the wind out. In 1884, Jenney completed the Home Insurance Building. It was only 10 stories tall, but it was the world's first skyscraper. It used a steel frame that weighed only 1/3 as much as a stone building of the same size. Steel, which was becoming cheap and plentiful thanks to the Bessemer process and American industrial might, had become the artificial bone of the city. Steam, the muscle of the sky. We often think of skyscrapers as modern, but they were born in the age of steam. Before electric cranes, it was steam-powered hoists and donkey engines that lifted the massive steel I-beams into the sky. Steam was the bloodline of the early skyscraper. Huge steam boilers in the basements not just heated the buildings, they powered the pumps that sent water up to the top floors, overcoming gravity, and fueled the early elevators. The skyscraper was, in essence, a massive machine for living, powered by the same coal-fired technology that ran the steam locomotives of the era. The race to the clouds. Once the steel frame and the safety elevator were married, the race to the sky became an American obsession. It became a symbol of corporate dominance. In the early 1900s, the Woolworth Building, the Cathedral of Commerce, used these technologies to reach 792 feet. But the true peak of this era arrived during the Great Depression. The Empire State Building was constructed in just 410 days. It was a miracle of logistics. Steel beams arrived from the mills in Pennsylvania, still warm to the touch, and were hoisted by steam and muscle into the New York fog. The skyscraper changed the American psyche. It turned the city from a sprawling mess into a vertical monument to efficiency. It allowed millions of people to work on 1 acre of land. It created the downtown as we know it. The chain reaction, how up
created in. The invention of the skyscraper triggered a chain reaction that built the modern world. Wind engineering. Architects had to learn how to keep a 1,000-foot building from swaying, leading to breakthroughs in aerodynamics. The revolving door. Invented because the air pressure inside a tall building was so high that regular doors were nearly impossible to pull open. Subways. Because skyscrapers packed so many people into one spot, cities were forced to build underground trains to move them all. Conclusion: the achievement of ambition. The skyscraper is America's greatest architectural gift to the world. It was born from the grit of Chicago and the capital of New York. It required the bravery of Elisha Otis, the genius of William LeBaron Jenney, and the sheer power of the steam engine. Today, we look at the Burj Khalifa or the Freedom Tower and see glass and light. But beneath that skin is the same American system perfected in the 1880s, a steel skeleton and a safe way to reach the top. We didn't just build buildings, we proved that the only limit to American growth was how high we were willing to climb.
The world of hot glass. To understand the revolution, you first have to understand the vacuum tube. In the early 1940s, if you wanted to build a radio, a television, or the world's first computer, you needed these glass tubes. They looked like light bulbs and worked similarly. They used a hot filament to control the flow of electricity. But vacuum tubes were a disaster. They were fragile, they got incredibly hot, and they burned out constantly. The first great American computer, the ENIAC, used nearly 18,000 vacuum tubes. It took up an entire room, consumed enough power to light a small town, and broke down every few hours because a tube would blow. Scientists realized that humanity had reached a glass ceiling. We could never build truly small, powerful, or reliable machines as long as we relied on hot glass and glowing wires. The Christmas miracle at Bell Labs. The solution didn't come from a computer company, but from the phone company. AT&T's Bell Labs in New Jersey was the greatest idea factory in American history. They needed a way to amplify phone signals across the country without using bulky, failing tubes. In December 1947, three physicists, John Bardeen, Walter Brattain, and William Shockley, were experimenting with a strange class of materials called semiconductors. Specifically, they were using germanium. They realized that if they placed two gold contacts just a hair's breadth apart on a crystal of germanium, they could control a large flow of electricity with a tiny one. On December 23rd, they saw it work. It was silent, it was cold, it was instant. They had created the point contact transistor. It did everything a vacuum tube could do, but it was smaller than a pea and used a fraction of the power. It was the birth of the solid-state world. The Traitorous Eight and the Move West. While the invention happened in New Jersey, the revolution happened in California because of a personality clash. William Shockley, one of the co-inventors, was a genius, but a notoriously difficult boss. He left Bell Labs and moved to Mountain View, California, near his aging mother, to start Shockley Semiconductor. He recruited the smartest young minds in America. But his paranoid management style eventually drove his top 8 engineers to do something unthinkable in the 1950s. They quit as a group. Shockley called them the Traitorous Eight. These 8 men, led by Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore, didn't just find new jobs, they founded Fairchild Semiconductor. This was the big bang of Silicon Valley. From Fairchild, dozens of other companies would spin off, often called Fairchildren, including a little company you might know called Intel. From germanium to silicon. The reason we call it Silicon Valley and not Germanium Valley is thanks to a massive American pivot. Early transistors used germanium, but it was temperamental and failed at high temperatures, like inside a jet engine or a hot car. The engineers at Fairchild and Texas Instruments realized that silicon, essentially highly purified sand, was the answer. It was stable, it was abundant, and it was the perfect gatekeeper for electricity.
By switching to silicon, they made the transistor cheap enough to be put into everything. The integration, the monolithic idea. In 1958, the story took its most dramatic turn. Jack Kilby at Texas Instruments and Noyce at Fairchild independently realized that instead of wiring individual transistors together on a board, they could etch multiple transistors onto a single sliver of silicon. This was the integrated circuit, the microchip. Suddenly, you didn't have to build a computer out of 10,000 separate parts. You could print the parts like a newspaper. This led to Moore's Law, the famous American prediction that the number of transistors on a chip would double every 2 years while the cost dropped. It is the only reason the smartphone in your pocket has more computing power than all of NASA had when they landed on the moon. The mission to the moon. The transistor's killer app was the space race. In the early 1960s, the U.S. government became the biggest buyer of transistors and chips. They needed a computer light enough to fit in a tiny capsule heading for the moon. Vacuum tubes were too heavy and would shatter during liftoff. The Apollo guidance computer was the first major machine to use integrated circuits. This government funding de-risked the technology, allowing Silicon Valley to scale up production and eventually bring the technology to the American home in the form of calculators, digital watches, and PCs. The success, a new American economy. The transistor did something no other invention had done. It democratized information. By making electronics small and cheap, it broke the monopoly that big governments and giant corporations had on data. Silicon Valley grew from a few orange groves into a trillion-dollar corridor of innovation because the transistor allowed for a bottom-up revolution. It led to the PC, the Internet, and artificial intelligence. Every like, every search, and every tweet is actually just billions of tiny transistors flipping on and off inside a silicon chip. Conclusion: the invisible giant. We don't build statues to the transistor. You can't see it working, and you'll never have to replace one like you do a light bulb, but it is the most manufactured object in human history. To date, humanity has produced more transistors than there are grains of sand on all the beaches of Earth. The story of the transistor is the story of American persistence. It's the story of 3 men in a New Jersey lab, 8 traders in a California garage, and a nation that decided to bet its future on a tiny sliver of sand. It didn't just build a valley, it built the modern world.
The invisible shield. In the dark days of 1940, the world was at war. Great Britain was being hammered by the Luftwaffe, and their only hope was a secret technology called radar, radio detection and ranging. Radar worked by sending out pulses of radio waves. When those waves hit a metal airplane, they bounced back, allowing the Allies to see the enemy in total darkness. But early radar was weak. To win the war, the Allies needed shorter, more powerful waves, microwaves. The holy grail of this tech was a device called the cavity magnetron. Developed in Britain, but mass-produced in America, the magnetron was a vacuum tube that could generate massive amounts of microwave energy. It was small enough to fit in a plane, allowing Allied pilots to hunt German U-boats from the sky. In the United States, the company tasked with building these war-winning tubes was Raytheon, and their lead engineer was a self-taught genius named Percy Spencer. The melted candy bar. Percy Spencer was the quintessential American success story. He never finished grammar school, but by the 1940s, he was one of the world's leading experts on radio tube design. One day in 1945, while the war was still raging, Spencer was standing in front of an active, high-powered radar set at the Raytheon lab. Suddenly, he noticed something strange. He felt a warm, tingly sensation in his pocket. He reached in and discovered that a Mr. Goodbar peanut cluster candy bar had turned into a gooey, melted mess.
Now, a normal person might have been annoyed about the ruined pants, but Spencer was a scientist. He knew that the room was cold. The radar set didn't give off heat in the traditional sense. He realized that the microwaves coming from the magnetron were vibrating the water and fat molecules inside the chocolate, creating friction, and friction creates heat. The popcorn and the egg. Spencer didn't tell his bosses right away. Instead, he went out and bought a bag of unpopped corn kernels. He held them in front of the magnetron. To the amazement of the engineers in the room, the kernels began to dance and explode. He had just created the world's first batch of microwave popcorn. The next day, he brought in a raw egg. He cut a hole in a kettle, placed the egg inside, and blasted it with microwaves. One of his colleagues leaned in to see what was happening just as the egg exploded, splattering hot yolk all over his face. The experiment was a success. They could cook food from the inside out, and they could do it in seconds. The radar range and the $5,000 price tag. When the war ended in 1945, Raytheon had a massive problem. They had huge factories built to make magnetrons, but no more bombers to put them in. They needed a civilian use for radar technology. In 1947, they released the radar range. But your audience would hardly recognize it. It was the size of a refrigerator, weighed 750 pounds, and cost more than $5,000, about $70,000 in today's money. It was water-cooled, meaning it had to be plumbed into the house like a sink. Unsurprisingly, it was a flop for the average American home. For 20 years, the microwave was a luxury used only in restaurants, high-end hotels, and ocean liners, where speed was more important than cost. The countertop revolution. The shift from military equipment to kitchen staple happened because of American miniaturization. In the 1960s, Raytheon bought a company called Amana. They worked to shrink the magnetron and air cool it, eliminating the need for plumbing. In 1967, the Amana radar range hit the market for $495. It finally fit on a countertop. But there was still a major hurdle: fear. Americans in the late 60s and early 70s were terrified of radiation. They associated the word with the atomic bomb and fallout. Raytheon had to launch a massive PR campaign to explain that non-ionizing microwaves were more like radio waves than nuclear X-rays. They hired home economists to show that you could cook a radar range Thanksgiving turkey in 45 minutes instead of 5 hours. The changing American lifestyle. The microwave didn't just change how we cooked, it changed the American family structure. In the 1970s and 80s, more women were entering the workforce than ever before. The traditional 3-hour dinner preparation was becoming impossible. The microwave was the liberator of the kitchen. It led to the rise of the TV dinner, the Hot Pocket, and the microwave meal. Because the microwave made it easy for children to cook for themselves safely, no open flames, it changed the way American kids grew up. The latchkey kid generation was fueled by the same technology that spotted the Japanese fleet at the Battle of Midway. The legacy, from war to peace. Today, over 90% of American households own a microwave. It is so common we rarely think about it as high technology. But every time you reheat your coffee, you are using a vacuum tube that was once a top-secret weapon of the United States military. The magnetron inside your microwave is almost identical in design to the ones used in 1945. We took a tool of destruction and, through American ingenuity and a melted candy bar, turned it into the ultimate tool of convenience. Conclusion: the spark of curiosity. The story of the microwave is the perfect example of the spin-off. It proves that the greatest inventions often come from the most unexpected places. It wasn't a chef who revolutionized the kitchen. It was a radar engineer who was curious about his chocolate bar. It reminds us that in America, we don't just win wars with technology. We use that technology to build a faster, easier, and more connected future. The next time you hear that ding from your kitchen, remember, you're listening to the sound of World War II history.
The luxury of the hand-built. To understand the revolution, you have to imagine the year 1900. If you wanted a car, you didn't go to a dealership, you went to a workshop. There, a group of highly skilled craftsmen, men who had spent decades learning to shape wood and forge steel, would build a car around you. They would lay the frame on the floor, and the workers would bring the parts to the car. They would file a gear by hand to make it fit a specific axle. They would hand-stitch the leather. Because every part was slightly different, the process was agonizingly slow. It took nearly 12 hours to assemble a single chassis. The result? A car was a rich man's toy. A typical automobile cost between $2,000 and $3,000 at a time when the average American worker earned about $500 a year. If you were a farmer, a teacher, or a factory hand, the idea of owning a car was as sci-fi as owning a private jet is today. The boy who hated chores. Henry Ford grew up on a farm in Dearborn, Michigan, and he had a secret. He despised farm work. He saw it as back-breaking, soul-crushing drudgery. He became obsessed with the idea of using machines to do the donkey work of humanity. By 1908, Ford had designed the Model T. It was a rugged, simple, and reliable car. But he had a problem. He couldn't build them fast enough to meet the demand. He realized that the problem wasn't the car, it was the process. He needed to stop bringing the people to the car and start bringing the car to the people. The disassembly line. The inspiration for the greatest leap in industrial history didn't come from a laboratory. It came from a Chicago meatpacking plant. One of Ford's engineers, William Pa Klon, visited a slaughterhouse and watched the disassembly line. Carcasses were hung on hooks and moved past workers on a conveyor. Each worker had one job. One man would remove the hide, the next would remove a specific cut of meat, and so on. Klon went back to Ford and said, if they can take a cow apart that way, why can't we put a car together that way? October 7th, 1913. The world shifts. In the summer and fall of 1913, in the Highland Park plant in Michigan, Ford and his team began the experiment. They started small, with the flywheel magneto. Instead of one man building a whole magneto in 20 minutes, they broke it into 29 steps. Suddenly, the time dropped to 13 minutes, then 5 minutes. Encouraged, they went for the big one. On October 7th, 1913, they tied a rope to a Model T chassis and used a winch to pull it across the factory floor. Workers stood at stations with piles of parts ready. The results were staggering. The time to build a chassis dropped from 12 hours to 93 minutes. The $5 day, the social explosion. But there was a dark side to this efficiency. The assembly line was boring. It was repetitive. It was human as machine. Workers hated it. In 1913, Ford had a turnover rate of 380%. He had to hire 52,000 people a year just to keep a workforce of 14,000. On January 5th, 1914, Ford made a move that shocked the world. He didn't just double the average wage, he exploded it. He announced the $5 day. At a time when most factory workers made $2.34 for a 9-hour shift, Ford paid $5 for an 8-hour shift. Critics called him a socialist. They said he would go bankrupt. But Ford was a genius of circulatory economics. He realized that if his workers made enough money, they could afford to buy the cars they were building. He wasn't just creating a product, he was creating a customer base. He was building the American middle class. The price drop that changed everything.
As the assembly line got faster, the price of the Model T plummeted. In 1908, the car cost $825. By 1916, it dropped to $360. Eventually, you could buy a brand new Ford for less than $300. Suddenly, the farmer didn't have to live and die within 10 miles of his birthplace. The city worker could live in a suburb and drive to the factory. The assembly line gave Americans mobility. It created the gas station, the roadside diner, and the paved highway system. The chain reaction, from cars to everything. The Fordist revolution didn't stop at the garage door. Because the assembly line made things so cheap, other industries were forced to adapt or die. Appliances, washing machines, refrigerators, and vacuum cleaners, once luxuries, were now being mass-produced on assembly lines, freeing American women from hours of domestic labor. Housing. After World War II, developers like William Levitt applied assembly line techniques to home building, Levitt towns, creating identical houses in record time and making homeownership a reality for millions of veterans. Food. The fast food industry, McDonald's, is essentially an assembly line for hamburgers. The legacy, the soul of the 20th century. The assembly line is the reason we live in a world of abundance. It is the reason a person with a modest income today can own a television, a smartphone, and a car, items that would have been magic to a king in the 1700s. It taught America how to scale. During World War II, this American system allowed the Willow Run plant to produce one B-24 Liberator bomber every hour. We didn't just outfight the Axis, we outproduced them using Henry Ford's rope and winch. Conclusion: the gift of time. The assembly line is often criticized for being cold and mechanical, but at its heart, it was a gift of time. By taking the drudgery out of making things, it allowed a nation to dream bigger. It turned the one-of-a-kind into the one-for-all. Today, as robots take over the assembly lines that Ford started, we should remember that it all began with a rope, a winch, and the radical American idea that a good life shouldn't be a luxury. It should be a standard.
The rise and fall of India rubber. In the 1830s, the United States was gripped by rubber fever. A strange, milky sap from the South American hevea tree had arrived on American shores. It was waterproof, stretchy, and seemingly miraculous. Investors poured millions into rubber factories to make shoes, life preservers, and coats. But there was a fatal flaw. Natural rubber was thermoplastic. In the humid American summers, rubber coats would melt into a sticky, foul-smelling glue. In the freezing winters, rubber boots would become as brittle as glass and shatter. By 1837, the rubber industry in America was dead. The miracle was considered a fraud. But one man refused to give up. His name was Charles Goodyear. The obsession of Charles Goodyear. Charles Goodyear was not a chemist. He was a bankrupt hardware merchant from Philadelphia. He became convinced that if he could just cure rubber, make it stable against heat and cold, he would unlock a treasure for humanity. Goodyear's obsession bordered on madness. He spent years in extreme poverty, often selling his children's school books to buy more raw rubber. He experimented in his kitchen, mixing rubber with everything from witch hazel to cream of tartar. He even spent time in a debtor's prison, where he continued to knead rubber at his small cell table. People called him the rubber maniac. The lucky accident. The breakthrough happened in 1839 in Woburn, Massachusetts. After years of failure, Goodyear was experimenting with a mixture of rubber, lead, and sulfur. As the story goes, Goodyear was showing off his latest formula at a local general store. In a moment of excitement, or perhaps an accidental slip of the hand, a piece of the sulfur-treated rubber landed on a red-hot, pot-bellied stove. Ordinarily, rubber would have melted into a puddle,
But when Goodyear scraped the rubber off the stove, he noticed something impossible. It hadn't melted. It had charred like leather. It was still flexible, but it was now tough and completely resistant to heat. By accidentally cooking the rubber with sulfur, Goodyear had triggered a chemical reaction called vulcanization, named after Vulcan, the Roman god of fire. He had created a material that could survive the American climate. The war for the patent. Goodyear had solved the puzzle, but his life didn't become easier. He was a brilliant inventor, but a terrible businessman. He struggled to secure his patents, and a British inventor named Thomas Hancock managed to reverse engineer Goodyear's process after seeing a sample. Goodyear spent the rest of his life in legal battles. He died in 1960, deeply in debt, never seeing the true riches his invention would generate. It is one of the great ironies of American history that the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, founded 38 years after his death, was named in his honor but had no financial connection to his family. The Industrial Explosion. Once rubber was vulcanized, it became the connective tissue of the Industrial Revolution. Without vulcanized rubber, the following would have been impossible. Steam engines. They needed rubber gaskets to hold high-pressure steam. The telegraph. It needed rubber insulation to protect underwater cables. The automobile. In 1888, John Dunlop and later the Michelin brothers applied vulcanized rubber to wheels, creating the pneumatic tire. America was now a nation on rubber. But as the 20th century dawned, a new challenge appeared. Natural rubber came from trees often controlled by foreign empires. America needed a way to make its own. The Synthetic Revolution, WW2. When Japan cut off 90% of the world's natural rubber supply during World War II, the U.S. military faced a catastrophe. No rubber meant no tires for jeeps, no treads for tanks, and no seals for B-17 bombers. In a massive Manhattan Project for materials, American scientists took Goodyear's vulcanization principles and applied them to petroleum-based chemicals. They created synthetic rubber. By 1945, American factories were churning out 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber a year. This wasn't just a wartime fix, it was a technological leap that made rubber cheaper and more versatile than ever before. The ultimate test. The Apollo moon tires. The story of the sticky accident on a stove in 1839 reaches its peak in 1971, when NASA designed the lunar roving vehicle for the Apollo 15, 16, and 17 missions. They faced a nightmare. The moon has no atmosphere. Temperatures swing from 250 degrees F in the sun to minus 250 degrees F in the shade. Standard air-filled tires would explode or shatter. Engineers at Goodyear, the company, turned back to the principles of advanced vulcanization and material science. They didn't use air. Instead, they built tires out of zinc-coated piano wire mesh with titanium treads held together by the same philosophy of durable, cured materials that Charles Goodyear had pioneered. These tires allowed astronauts to explore miles of the lunar surface, bringing back samples that taught us the history of the solar system. The Legacy, a world held together by rubber. Today, we live in a world defined by Charles Goodyear's accident. From the elastic in your waistband to the tires on a Boeing 747, and from the seals in a heart valve to the gaskets in the International Space Station, vulcanized rubber is the invisible hero of modern life. The story of rubber is the story of the American spirit, a mix of stubborn obsession, a stroke of lucky failure, and the industrial might to take an accident and turn it into a global empire. Conclusion. The lesson of the stove. Charles Goodyear once said, "Life should not be estimated exclusively by the standard of dollars and cents. I am not disposed to complain that I have planted and others have gathered the fruits." He died a pauper, but he gave America the wheels to move and the boots to walk on the moon. The next time you see a tire, remember the man who was called a maniac and the hot stove that changed the course of human history.
The chaos of the colonial road. Imagine America in the mid-1700s. There were no interstates, no GPS, and certainly no standard maps. If you were sending a letter from Philadelphia to Boston, you were essentially throwing it into a black hole. The Postal Service was a disorganized mess of private riders and muddy trails. In those days, the cost of sending mail wasn't based on a simple stamp. It was based on distance. But there was a massive problem. Nobody actually knew how long the roads were. One post rider might claim a route was 20 miles, another, looking for a higher fee, might swear it was 30. For the colonists, this was more than an inconvenience. It was an obstacle to unity. Information was the bloodline of the revolution, and that lifeblood was moving far too slowly. The Postmaster General's vision. In 1753, the British Crown appointed Benjamin Franklin as the joint Postmaster General for the colonies. At the time, the colonial post office had never turned a profit. Franklin, ever the scientist and businessman, realized that you cannot manage what you cannot measure. Franklin was obsessed with efficiency. He didn't just want the mail to be faster, he wanted it to be accountable. He decided he needed to map the major postal routes of the northern colonies, specifically the King's Best Road between Philadelphia and Boston. But Franklin wasn't content with guessing. He needed a scientific way to count every single rotation of a carriage wheel. The invention of the road measurer. While the concept of a distance measuring device went back to ancient Rome, Vitruvius had described one, but it was bulky and impractical. Franklin, sitting in his workshop, designed a version specifically for the rugged American carriage. The device was a series of gears housed in a small wooden box. It was attached to the hub of the carriage's front wheel. Every time the wheel completed a full revolution, a gear would click. After a certain number of clicks, representing a fraction of a mile, the gears would turn a dial on the face of the box. In the summer of 1763, Franklin set out on a 1,600-mile journey. He wasn't just riding for pleasure, he was digitizing the American wilderness. Every time the odometer hit the 1-mile mark, he would stop the carriage. His assistants would then hop out and place a milestone, a heavy stone slab, into the dirt. The birth of the Standard Mile. As Franklin traveled, he began to notice something shocking. Many of the routes were actually shorter than the post riders had been claiming. By using the odometer, Franklin was able to audit the American road system. He standardized the routes and, more importantly, he standardized the rates. Suddenly, the public knew exactly what a letter would cost. Because the routes were now measured and marked with milestones, riders could be held to a schedule. Franklin's odometer turned the post office into a machine. Under his leadership, the mail between Philadelphia and New York began running 3 times a week instead of once, and for the first time in history, the colonial post office actually turned a profit. The chain reaction, from mail to maps. Franklin's use of the odometer triggered a revolution in American geography. The first maps. By knowing the exact distances between towns, surveyors could create the first truly accurate maps of the colonies. The stagecoach industry. Accurate mileage allowed for the creation of timetables. For the first time, an American could buy a ticket and know exactly when they would arrive in a distant city. The Revolutionary War. When the war broke out, the Committee of Secret Correspondence, which Franklin led, used these measured routes to move intelligence past British lines with predictable speed. The evolution, mechanical to digital. The odometer stayed on the carriage wheels for another century, but as the steam engine and the automobile arrived, Franklin's invention had to evolve. In 1903, 2 brothers from Beloit, Wisconsin, Arthur and Charles Warner, patented the autometer. It took Franklin's gear-driven concept and added a tachometer to measure speed as well. This was the birth of the modern dashboard. Eventually, the spinning cables and physical gears were replaced by magnetic sensors and digital displays.
Today, your car uses Hall effect sensors to count wheel rotations with a precision that would have made Franklin weep with joy. But the math remains exactly the same as it was in 1763. The achievement, quantifying the dream. Why does the odometer matter to a USA Facts channel? Because it represents the moment America moved from exploration to organization. Franklin's odometer was the first step toward the interstate highway system. It was the ancestor of the trip meter you use on your summer vacation and the odometer disclosure statement you sign when you buy a used car. It turned the vast, scary American distance into something manageable, measurable, and, most importantly, conquerable. Conclusion: the man who measured a nation. Benjamin Franklin didn't just give us the lightning rod and the bifocals. He gave us the ability to know where we are and how far we've gone. He understood that in a country as large as America, distance is the enemy of democracy. The next time you look at your dashboard and see your mileage, remember the 57-year-old Ben Franklin bouncing along a muddy trail in a horse-drawn carriage, listening to the steady click, click, click of his wooden gears as he laid the literal milestones of the United States.
The 1880 Nightmare. In the late 19th century, America was exploding. Immigrants were pouring through Ellis Island, cities were skyrocketing, and the frontier was closing. By law, the U.S. Constitution requires a census every 10 years to determine everything from taxes to seats in Congress. But by 1887, the Census Bureau hit a wall. They were still tabulating the results of the 1880 census by hand. It had taken 7 years to count 50 million people using nothing but pen, paper, and tally marks. The director of the census looked at the growth of the nation and realized a terrifying truth. By the time they finished counting the 1890 census, it would likely be 1900. The data would be obsolete before it was even published. The American government was literally drowning in its own information. They needed a miracle where the entire democratic system of representation would collapse under the weight of paperwork. The man from Columbia, Herman Hollerith. Enter Herman Hollerith, a young German-American engineer and former census employee. Hollerith was a man who hated inefficiency. Legend has it that while watching a train conductor punch holes in passenger tickets to identify them, hair color, eye color, etc., he had a lightning bolt moment. He realized that if a person's life, their age, gender, occupation, and birthplace could be reduced to a series of holes in a card, a machine could read that person at the speed of electricity. He moved to Washington, D.C., and began building the Hollerith tabulating machine. It was a contraption of brass, wood, and dials that looked more like a pipe organ than a computer. But inside its wires sat the future of the world. The knitting needle revolution. In 1889, the government held a competition to see who could process census data the fastest. Hollerith's punch card system didn't just win, it humiliated the competition. Where manual counters took 100 hours to process a set of data, Hollerith's machine did it in 5. The system was elegant but strange. A census worker would use a pantograph to punch holes in a dollar bill-sized card. Each hole represented a fact. A hole in position A meant male. A hole in position B meant farmer. The card was then placed in a press. A series of spring-loaded pins, looking like knitting needles, would drop onto the card. Where there was a hole, the pin would pass through and dip into a tiny cup of mercury. This completed an electrical circuit, which triggered a dial on the front of the machine to move forward by 1. The 1890 miracle. When the 1890 census officially began, the results shocked the world. Despite the U.S. population having jumped to 62 million people, Hollerith's machines finished the tally in just 6 weeks. The tabulator didn't just count people, it allowed for big data for the first time. For the first time in history, the government could ask complex questions.
They didn't just know how many people lived in New York. They could cross-reference how many Austrian-born carpenters over the age of 40 lived in New York at the press of a button. America had become the first nation on Earth to be digitized. The birth of a giant, from CTR to IBM. Hollerith knew his machine was too valuable to just be used once every 10 years. In 1896, he founded the Tabulating Machine Company. He began selling his services to railroads to track freight and insurance companies to track mortality rates. But Hollerith was an engineer, not a salesman. In 1911, his company merged with 3 others to form the Computing Tabulating Recording Company, or CTR. In 1914, the company hired a legendary salesman named Thomas J. Watson. Watson was the man who put the word "think" on every desk. He saw that the punch card was the future of all global business. In 1924, he rebranded the company with a bold, ambitious new name, International Business Machines, or IBM. The World War and the Social Security Act. The real test of Hollerith's punch cards came during the Great Depression. In 1935, Franklin Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act. Suddenly, the government had to track the earnings and benefits of 26 million American workers. It was the largest bookkeeping task in human history. Without IBM's punch card machines, the Social Security system would have been physically impossible to manage. Every American was given a number, the Social Security number, which was essentially a digital address on a punch card. During World War II, these same machines were used for everything from tracking the millions of tons of supplies sent to the front lines to calculating the complex ballistics of artillery shells. From cards to pixels. The punch card remained the primary way humans talked to machines for nearly 80 years. If you look at an old computer from the 1960s, you'll see rows of cabinets designed to read those same rectangular cards that Hollerith invented for the 1890 census. Eventually, the physical whole was replaced by a magnetic charge on a hard drive, and then by a flash of light in a fiber optic cable. But the logic remains the same. The binary code of ones and zeros is just the modern version of whole or no hole. Every time you look at a pixel on your screen, you are looking at the direct descendant of a hole punched in a piece of paper in a dusty Washington office 136 years ago. The legacy, the information age. Why does this matter for your U.S. audience? Because it proves that the computer age wasn't born in a garage in the 1970s. It was born from the American Constitution's requirement to count its people. The need for a fair democracy created the need for a machine that could think. Hollerith didn't just invent a tabulator. He invented the idea that information is a resource, just like coal or oil. He turned the people into the data, and in so doing, he gave America the tools to lead the 20th century. Conclusion: the first like. Herman Hollerith died in 1929, just as IBM was beginning its ascent to global dominance. He never saw a microchip, and he never saw the internet. But the next time you filter a search result on Amazon or click a button on an app, remember the knitting needles and the cups of mercury. The 1890 census was the moment America stopped being a collection of names in a book and became a digital nation. We didn't just count the population, we invented the future.
The fear of the invisible. In October 1957, the world changed forever. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first man-made satellite. As it beeped its way across the American sky, scientists at Johns Hopkins University's Applied Physics Lab noticed something strange. By measuring the Doppler effect, the way the radio signal's pitch changed as the satellite passed overhead, they could track exactly where the satellite was from the ground. Then came the reverse epiphany. If you knew exactly where a satellite was in space, could you use it to find out exactly where you were on the ground?
At the height of the Cold War, this wasn't about finding a coffee shop, it was about survival. The U.S. Navy needed a way to guide its Polaris submarines, which carried nuclear missiles. If a submarine didn't know its precise location in the trackless ocean, its missiles wouldn't know where to land. The quest for global positioning began as a desperate attempt to ensure the American nuclear deterrent was accurate. The hidden genius, Gladys West. For decades, the history of GPS focused on generals and physicists, but the true brain of the system was a black woman named Gladys West. Working at the Naval Surface Warfare Center in Virginia in the 1950s and 60s, West was a human computer. Her task was monumental. She had to create an impossibly accurate mathematical model of the Earth, known as a geoid. Because the Earth isn't a perfect sphere, it bulges at the equator and has uneven gravity, a satellite couldn't just guess where the ground was. West's complex algorithms accounted for every wobble and distortion of our planet. Without her math, GPS wouldn't be off by a few feet, it would be off by miles. The 24-satellite shield. By the 1970s, the project evolved into Navstar GPS. The Department of Defense began launching a constellation of 24 satellites, each carrying a high-precision atomic clock. This is the magic of GPS your audience needs to know. The satellites don't track you. They don't know you exist. They are simply giant space-borne clocks that scream the time and their location down to Earth. Your phone receives these signals from at least 4 satellites and calculates the tiny differences in the time it took for each signal to arrive. This process, called trilateration, allows your phone to solve for your exact latitude, longitude, and altitude. The Selective Availability Wall. For years, the U.S. military kept the good GPS for themselves. They feared that if the signal were too accurate, enemy nations could use American satellites to guide their own missiles against U.S. cities. They implemented a program called Selective Availability. They intentionally fuzzed the civilian signal, making it only accurate to about 300 feet. It was good enough for a boat in the middle of the ocean, but useless for driving a car down a city street. The military kept the encrypted signal accurate to within centimeters, locked away behind top-secret codes. The tragedy of KAL 007. The turning point for the world happened because of a tragedy. In 1983, a Korean Airlines flight, KAL 007, accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace because of a navigational error. The Soviets, thinking it was a spy plane, shot it down, killing all 269 people on board, including an American congressman. President Ronald Reagan was horrified. He realized that if the pilots had access to GPS, they would have known they were off course. Shortly after, he issued an executive order. Once the GPS system was fully operational, it would be made available to the entire world for free for the safety of civil aviation. The Big Flip of 2000. Even with Reagan's order, the signal was still fuzzed by selective availability. This changed on May 2, 2000. Under the Clinton administration, the military finally flipped the switch and turned off the intentional degradation. Overnight, civilian GPS accuracy went from the length of a football field to the size of a hula hoop. This was the big bang for the American economy. Suddenly, companies like Garmin and TomTom exploded. But the real revolution was still invisible: the smartphone explosion. In 2007, the iPhone changed how we interacted with the world, but it was the integration of a tiny GPS chip that made it a smartphone. Suddenly, the military secret was in the pocket of every teenager in America. This triggered a chain reaction that built the on-demand economy. Uber and Lyft, impossible without real-time GPS tracking of drivers and riders. Tinder and Bumble, location-based dating, relies entirely on the constellation, the power grid.
Interestingly, the most important part of GPS today isn't the location, it's the time. The atomic clocks on GPS satellites synchronize the world's banking transactions and power grids. If GPS went down today, the global economy would freeze in seconds. The legacy, a gift from the U.S. taxpayer. The most incredible fact about GPS is this: it costs the American taxpayer about $2 million a day to maintain the satellites, yet the U.S. government provides the signal to every person on Earth, even our rivals, for free. It is perhaps the greatest public good in human history. It's a technology that started with the fear of nuclear war and ended up ensuring that no one, anywhere on the planet, ever has to be lost again. Conclusion: the invisible compass. We no longer look at the stars to find our way. We look at a screen that talks to the stars for us. The story of GPS is the story of American generosity and genius. It took the math of Gladys West, the vision of Ronald Reagan, and the precision of 24 atomic clocks to give us the world in our pockets. The next time you see that blue dot on your map, remember, you were looking at a military secret that became a global heartbeat.